Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. And this week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that. I am really looking forward to the conversation today. It's with my friend Jen Wilkin, who is an author, Bible teacher. She lives in Dallas, and she has written with J.T. English a book called You Are a Theologian, an invitation to know and love God well. She also writes a column for Christianity Today, and she writes and teaches all over the place. And Jen Wilkin, thanks for being with us today.
I'm so glad to be on. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to talk about a column that you wrote. It's rare that somebody writes on something that one thinks, I don't think I've ever seen this written about before. And this was one of those things you wrote about. I think the title was Honor Our Mothers with Wages. So what was your argument in that column?
Well, you will know that we don't always choose the titles for our articles.
Correct.
And yet when I saw that one, I thought, yeah, that's apropos. Really, the thought process began with an exploration I've done for a while over the nature of the fifth commandment to honor our fathers and mothers. And a lot of the work that we've done in my own local church around understanding the church as the family of God. And so even the Puritans, you go back to the Westminster Confession, and they understood the fifth commandment to expand beyond just our mothers and fathers by birth. They understood it to be those who were our superiors in experience or age, or who are placed in authority over us. So you look at the local church, and you have to ask the question, how well does the local church mirror a healthy nuclear family as we understand it? Lifeway did a survey of women's ministry leaders, and they were looking at what percentage of them were paid. And the statistics came back that 83% of women's ministry leaders are not compensated. And in fact, you would, and obviously everybody knows that who gets compensated in a particular church has a lot to do with the size of the church. But when you looked at churches even of larger sizes, churches in attendance of 500 or more, still only 29% of women's ministry leaders were paid full-time. 24% were paid part-time. And the shocking statistic is that almost half, 46%, received no pay at all. So looking at the church as the family of God, one then begins to wonder why would the person who serves over half of the adult population at the church be serving in a capacity that is not always dignified with wages?
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors that play into it. I think that the historic space in the church for women's ministry has been one that is volunteer. And I speak as someone who did women's ministry for most of my time in church employment in a volunteer capacity. And I understand the beauty of volunteering. I build organizations that are volunteer run, and that is what most staff members are looking to do. That's what a healthy church does. It's deploying the efforts of volunteers. But there do seem to be patterns that happen in the local church where we will identify a man who has been a key volunteer for a long time and think, man, we should really hire that guy. But we are sometimes forgetful to do that with women. And women are willing to do this work unpaid until Jesus returns because we value it so much. Which brings me to, I think, another one of the issues at stake is that if the work is not understood to the point that it's properly valued, then those who are making decisions related to budget, specifically HR budgets, are probably going to prioritize those dollars for ministries that they see more value in.
Do you think it's that they take that work for granted? They just assume that it's going
Well, if you
on?
consider that most of the key leadership roles in the local church are filled by men, it's understandable that they're probably not spending a great deal of time in what I affectionately refer to as the pink ghetto. They don't show up on a Tuesday morning for women's Bible study. It's not that they don't care. It's that they have they have no framework for it. And so it's hard to value something that you haven't even seen or taken part in. And so that's understandable. I would refer to it, it's a benign neglect, but neglect in any form can be harmful to the church. And so when we think about the unique role that a church mother fulfills, a woman who is a visible representative, in many cases a visible advocate for the women of the church, but also is an example
Mhm.
that younger women can look up to and learn from. We want those women to be present in the life of the church, and we want their work to be valued properly. So, you look at the statistics on student ministry. We want students to be valued in the church, but typically there are fewer students who are being served week in and week out in a church than there would be women who are being served. But we rarely say, yeah, well, let's just have a volunteer student minister. We look for a way to secure that person's interest for the long term and to build ministries that have stability and sustainability over the long term by paying a fair wage. And so if we value women's ministry, we should think about doing the same.
What about somebody who's listening to this, who's a part of a church, maybe not in leadership
Mhm.
at that church, but is there all the time? How would you know, in terms of what would you look for to know whether women's ministry in whatever form is really valued in that
Yeah.
church? You don't have access to the budget necessarily, but you're kind of looking around at the church. How would
Mhm.
you know
You
that?
can usually tell, calendar and budget are the two biggest indicators. Budget can be reflected even if you don't have eyes on the actual budget itself, which I would have some questions about that if I were in a church. But if you don't have eyes on the actual
Yeah.
budget itself, you can look at who's on the website, and you can see how the website is structured, how visible is the ministry, how effective is the ministry. In other words, are the things that it's offering substantive? And I do think that part of the roadblock in this conversation is that in many cases, women's ministry is characterized as not being substantive. And I would say that probably in some cases that can be true. And so the desire is not simply to have women who are paid in these positions, but it's to have ministries that are spiritual formation spaces. And if women's ministry is seen as being ancillary or auxiliary to that function, then it would make sense that we're not paying women in these roles. But if we understand it to be part of a holistic spiritual formation strategy, which I believe it can be and should be, and in my experience has been, then we would want there to be a person leading in that space who understands, who is in a reciprocal value-bearing relationship. So in other words, the church is invested in her and she's invested in the church. And that is shown in the way that the resources have been allocated.
One of the things that you pointed out in your column is that it's not just that women are fulfilling all of these job description things, but also in many cases, a woman staff member is the one who is the advocate for other
Mhm.
women in the
Mhm.
congregation. I mean, I can think of case after case after case of, say,
Right.
sexual abuse issues like that within a congregation where the women's ministry leader or the staff
Mhm.
member who's a woman in some other capacity bears the full weight of helping somebody through that process.
Absolutely. And so when you think about single gender spaces, the most likely space in the church where a disclosure is going to happen of abuse is going to be in a single gender space. It's going to be from one woman to another. And so that means that you're going to want to have those women who are receiving those stories, whether they're a volunteer or wherever they fall in the chain of communication, you want them to understand how they are to respond to that. Is this something that is above their pay grade that they need to roll up the chain so that that woman is getting the help that she needs? And we've seen this again and again. It's one of the reasons that I absolutely love women's Bible study as a thing, because we gather around the scriptures, but we know that the vulnerability that will result in those discussion times is something that is going to allow for those kinds of disclosures to happen. But Not just that, pastoral concerns that arise just around maybe it's a sin pattern that a woman would not disclose in a mixed gender group that needs the mentorship and the help and accountability that a female leader can provide. And so if we value these things in the abstract, we should also be able to value them in their specific applications, where we understand that having a female in that space, in particular, a church mother, is a value that cannot be added by a male leader, and therefore we should ask, what is that worth? What is that worth to us? And obviously, again, the size of a church is going to determine whether you're paying even men in staff roles that might need to be filled. And I do think that as we look toward the future, there are big questions about who will be paid at all as it relates to church staffs. But we're looking at in the results in this survey a big inequity, not a small one, a glaring inequity.
There are some people who would say, well, we shouldn't have single gender sort of ministries at all. I was talking one time to a woman who's a professional. She's very high up in her particular career. And she said, at our church, the men's breakfast or the men's Bible study is dealing with things like Zechariah, if it's going deep into so, or it's dealing with kind of questions of leadership and how to live. And the women's ministry is much more relational and dealing with a lot of issues related to marriage and parenting, which she said, I'm all for having equipping for marriage and parenting, but she's not. She doesn't have kids. She's not married, and so it didn't relate to her. And she just said, "Why do we need it this way?"
Yeah, a lot of that can be personality driven. It can be based on your own facility of forming friendships with people of the opposite sex. I grew up with 4 brothers. I have no issues with forming friendships with men. That's an easy thing for me. It can be hard for a lot of women. Not only that, but the more theologically conservative the space is that we're talking about these environments happening in, there are very real social penalties for a woman entering into a mixed gender discussion at a thought level instead of a feelings level. She gets painted a lot of ways when she does that. And so even if you look sociologically at the way that men and women relate, so take it out of the church, just place it in the culture at large. Statistically speaking, sociologically, men tend to offer twice as many comments as women in a discussion, and they tend to enter in at the thought level while women tend to enter in at the feelings level. So now transpose that into a church environment where a woman who speaks up too often can be characterized a particular way. For those who follow the Enneagram, the big joke among women in Christian leadership is, even if you're not a 2, you got to act like a 2. If you're going to be able to fit it, you got to be the helper all the time. And so in a single gender space, then what we're able to do is we're able to open up places where, my drumbeat is Bible literacy, and for women specifically, I'm calling them to a life of the mind as it relates to their faith, and it's directly related to this conversation. But for a woman to be able to enter at a thought level into a conversation about the scriptures, often the first place she'll do that is in a single gender space, because we remove any potential that there will be misunderstanding by a man who's listening and thinking, well, she's pushy, or, who does she think she is? And again, this is not me assuming the worst of my male counterparts. Like I said, I tend to assume the best of them. In fact, my challenging relationships tend to be female. So the irony of my life is that I spend my time in predominantly female settings, but I've learned to love it so much and to see how, when you think about the ministries of the local church, you don't want an either or. You don't want just all male or all female. You don't want just mixed. You want the benefits of both of those spaces to be functioning in your church.
One of the things, and we've talked about this before, that's necessary for this kind of Bible literacy, and as you and JT English are talking about in your book, for theological literacy, would be teachers. And one of the things that we have seen, and I think they're probably related with the other things we've been talking about, is we have, at least historically, I don't think we've always done this well, but I think there's a sort of awareness that we're looking out for young men who may be potential pastors or teachers in some way. in a way that we haven't when it comes to women, not women
Mhm.
involved in the church, but women
Mhm.
specifically as
Mhm.
Bible teachers. And what advice would you give to somebody who she thinks that God's calling her to teach the Bible, but she's in a congregation where she doesn't have that kind of cultivation and development toward that end? What should
Mhm.
she
Well,
do?
JT and I firmly believe that that kind of instruction should be available and should be happening in the local church. But we also recognize that that's not always the
Hmm.
case. And so, we live in an age where access is easier than it's ever been for theological instruction. A lot of the traditional barriers to entry that have kept women from being able to opt into those spaces have sort of come down in the last 5 or 10 years, especially with COVID and so many more virtual opportunities. I am an example of someone for whom life never provided the time, space, and resources to invest in formal theological training, but I don't advocate for that. So if you're in a local church and you're wondering, how do I get started? Then I would say dip your toe in the water. I'm actually doing some work through Lifeway Women called Lifeway Women Academy, where we are offering theological training by women for women. Not because we think that the message necessarily changes when it's taught by a woman, but because we understand that when you see, this is my experience, when you see another woman doing this well, that you begin to recognize yourself in that and you're pulled forward. But the Lord doesn't give us gifts that are nice but not necessary. He gives us gifts that are essential and indispensable. And so if you are developing a teaching gift, you can know that should your local church not provide a space for that to be exercised, it doesn't mean that there will not be a space for it to be exercised. It just may be that you need to have eyes to look elsewhere to do it. But again, my hope is that the local church will see value and dignify the work that you're doing.
One of the things that whenever we talk about these issues that immediately emerges is the complementarian, egalitarian sorts of arguments. It seems to me that complementarianism, egalitarianism still around, both of them, but that debate has changed somewhat over the last few years. Do you think that's the case? And if so, where do you think that this discussion about what should be the
Mhm.
differences, if any, between gifting and calling
Right.
with men and women, where do you think that's what do you think that's going to look like in the future? And I guess one piece of that I'm really interested in is to say, how much can we get along and work together in a common mission, even when we disagree on some of these things, the way that we do, say, with really
Mhm.
major
Mhm.
emphases in the Bible, such as baptism and Lord's Supper. We're able to figure out how to cooperate without being in agreement on all of those. Is that possible with this debate
Thank
or
you for
not?
asking such a small and simple question,
Yeah,
Dr. Moore.
sorry.
Um, yeah, so I think that we live in fractious times, and so it's difficult to say that any conversation in which people differ is going to come to a place of parity anytime in the near future, but we will certainly all pray that direction. I do think that in the complementarian circle, the issue of preaching has just reached a fever pitch, and who can do it and what is it? And I do think that complementarians can do each other a favor by clarifying terms as much as possible. In other words, what is preaching? What is it not? If it's tone of voice, if it's content, then lots of people are preaching. If it has to do with a particular person in a particular setting, then we've clarified things a great deal. My own church did a lot of work around this, which meant that in a complementarian setting, I've been able to have a lot of clarity about where the lines are. Clarity is kindness. And so this is the work of every local church. You need to land somewhere, and then you need to operate out of that perspective. And I think if we spent less time worrying about what the church next door is doing and more time making sure that our own local church is functioning in a healthy way, then the conversation might simmer down a little. And I also do believe firmly that this issue of the family of God as the paradigm for determining whether a church has a healthy practice of male-female roles should be examined. So if you can quote your theological statement to me all day long and you can show me all of your, and I believe me, I know which passages you're going to quote, and you're going to tell me how you got there. But when I come and visit your church, I see a family that is functionally an authoritarian father and children and an absentee mother, then I've got questions about how your practice has translated from your theology into a healthy family.
I think that is exactly right. And that's I think one of the things that if we actually see that biblical pattern of household of God, then we realize there are some things that are different about mothers
Absolutely.
and fathers. But usually those things are not trackable on a chart. They're more in terms of vibe. And so you just can't say, well, the mother's the nurturer
Right.
and the father's
Right.
authoritative, because any father that's only authoritative and not nurturing is an awful human being. And any mother that's nurturing and not authoritative is not going to
That's
be a
right.
mother for long. So you do have most of what we're doing is
Yeah.
in sync with some
And I think
differences.
too that an important point to note in the discussion of the family of God is that when we have an absentee mother situation in the local church, the women of our churches don't stop looking for a mother. They go outside of the church to find that mother. And one of the things that I find in conversations with pastors through the years is if I were to mention the names of the most influential Big C church or parachurch women, they either would know the name but nothing about the woman, or they would not even have heard the name before. And yet these women are functional church mothers for over half of their congregation. And so when we leave the work of ministry undone in the local church, women don't stop looking for women's ministry. They go elsewhere to find it. So you've essentially, by the sin of omission, outsourced spiritual formation of your women to, you don't actually know who. It might be the church down the road, or it might be an internet presence. And so that's another reason that having a creative imagination around identifying and developing the gifts of female leaders in your church is significant. Because if you believe that your theology is distinctive in the first place, then don't entrust the formation of half of your congregation to people whose names you barely know and whose theological positions you may have no knowledge of at all.
You mentioned clarity is kindness, and yet I think that on this issue particularly, there are a lot of people who previously had clarity, but who feel as though they don't have at least as much clarity anymore, because I'm finding a lot of people, and I find myself in this category, for whom the sorts of things that they previously would have dismissed as caricatures and would have rolled their eyes at have proven to be at least partly true. So egalitarian Christians who would roll their eyes when people said, well, this eventually leads to refusal to call God Father, or it eventually leads to a doing away with a Christian sexual ethic or so forth, are looking around and saying, wow, it really did do that. And a lot of us who used to roll our eyes when people would say, well, complementarianism is misogyny and so forth, like, come on, don't caricature it, are now looking around in the aftermath of a lot of things that have been revealed over the past several years and saying, oh, a lot of this is misogyny. And that's especially true when you have some people now, especially men, younger men, who will say this, who essentially will say, yeah, this is misogyny and misogyny is great. So are you finding this, that some of the certainty
Well,
is
I do
gone?
think that what has been symptomatic of this particular debate is and probably of all debates of all time, is if you are only concerned about yelling to your left, you're going to get sucker punched from the right. And if you're only concerned about yelling to the right, then you're going to get sucker punched from the left. I'm not a huge fan of slippery slope arguments. I think that they imply that you can never land somewhere other than at an extreme, and I don't think that's true. But I do think that if you only have one enemy, if you're not aware of where both ditches are, then the other ditch is going to come for you. And so maybe that is a slippery slope argument. I don't know. But I think it's where your vulnerability will be, certainly. And I don't think it means that you have to end up there, but I think it's where you're going to make your mistakes. And so, for those who are in my part of the argument, I think that's what we have seen. And then for those, no one is going to think that just because what I hate is that I've seen a lot of people move from one side to the other thinking that a theological change is going to fix everything. And, the issue is not that. It's who wins and who loses in certain rooms. There are all kinds of factors at play. But a theological position outside of the closed hand of orthodoxy does not really guarantee that you're going to function in healthy ways. It has so much more to do with how these things hit the pavement.
That is true. And that applies to almost everything. You will have people who will make a theological transition thinking that where they're going is going to answer all of the problems. And so I've seen people do this with Calvinism, with Pentecostalism, with Catholicism, with Eastern, with almost anything in any direction. And then they get there and realize, oh, wait, I still have the same problems that I had before, and this doesn't magically fix it.
Yeah. What a message of hope we've delivered this morning, Dr. Moore.
No. Well, I think it is a message of hope in the sense that once you realize, okay, what God's calling us to is not going to be, it's a lifelong pilgrimage and calling. It can't be fixed with just, okay, here's a set of syllogisms. We've got it. And now we can move on.
Right.
That's just not what the Christian life
well,
is
and
like.
all theology is autobiography. And a lot of times the impetus for wanting to make a theological change is deeply personal. And I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge the role that deep hurt can play in wanting to reevaluate theological positions, and I don't want to dismiss it. But I do think we do need to be sober-minded about what we really will receive on the other side of those things, and to not be hasty.
Yeah, but you and JT wrote this book. You are a theologian, and I'm wondering, I think there are some people for whom that might sound like an insult. I think there are some people who would say, wow, when you say you are a theologian, I don't really want to intellectualize and sort of wring the life out of stuff. So what do you mean when you say you're a theologian?
Well, we mean that you're a person who has words about God, which means that, every human being has words about God, whether they're a Christian or not. We all have thoughts about God. We all have conceptions of God. And so the press in the book is that you would be a distinctly Christian theologian and that you would be able to think Christianly in all matters of life. And that in doing so, you would pass along the good deposit. We wrote the book because we believe that it's nothing less than a Great Commission issue. We think about the Great Commission often in terms of evangelism, but the call in the Great Commission is to make disciples. And a disciple is someone who has Christian thoughts about God, who is a Christian theologian. A disciple is someone who is not only able to follow Christ, but who's able to turn and tell the next generation, to the one generation would tell the next of the wonderful works of God. And yet it would appear by many measures that we are failing at that. And that was a major impulse behind us wanting to write something that would be accessible to the average learner. And that's a term that JT and I use in a completely non-pejorative sense. I actually view myself as the average learner in just about every space that I enter into. But we believe that every person who calls on the name of Christ should have a base level understanding of what it means to be a Christian and should be able to tell another person who they're bringing along in their discipleship path about those truths.
Do you think that cultural shifts make a difference when it comes to not to the truth of the Bible, but to the particular issues that have to be
Mhm.
emphasized or that where one starts. I mean, I think of, I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday who said, we've gone through this cultural shift where we had a time, and in some contexts people are really aware of
Mhm.
sin and guilt, even if they're
Mhm.
not believers. They're grappling with guilt and with justice and so forth. And so it's relatively easy to start there and to move forward. But there are other times, and this person thought we were in one of those times, where the fundamental question is
Mhm.
meaning. Does anything mean anything at all? And so you start
Mhm.
there. You're going to get meaning in the first, and you're going to get sin and guilt in the second. But you're just recognizing where the moment is culturally. Do you think that's something to pay attention to, or just learn what the Scripture teaches about God and let God
Well,
handle the rest?
I think it's both. I mean, I think we need that baseline understanding, and then I think we need to recognize how the moment in which we live is impacting our understanding of those things. I would say the two primary impulses that are eroding our theological acumen are, well, I'll try to narrow it down to two. But one would be, I believe the cycle that we've seen the church in for the last 30 or 40 years has been one of having a creep of individualism into the church, the individualistic mindset. And you hear it in the way that many of us were given a gospel presentation. It's that God loves you, Jen, and he wants a personal relationship with you, Jen. Now, that's a true and beautiful statement, and it's an important one, especially if the church was at that time potentially coming out of a cycle where that had been underemphasized. But as pendulums do, they don't typically just land in the middle. They swing another direction before they right size. And so I think that we find a lot of people who think that just them and the Bible and the Holy Spirit is all that they need, and that church is a nice option should they want to avail themselves of it. And so that means that when it comes to matters of understanding the Christian faith, they take counsel with themselves on many of these matters. So I think the doctrine of the church has been one of the doctrines that has taken the biggest hit in the last 30 or 40 years. And then additionally, I think that the doctrine of God has been de-emphasized, that we've lost a sense of a transcendent God and replaced it with an overstatement on the immanence of God, that God is our Father, but we've forgotten that he is our Father who is in heaven. He is seated enthroned between the cherubim. And so we then grow too big in our own estimation. So actually, the two things I mentioned are pointing to each other in many ways. So when it comes to the question of discipleship, well, we've forgotten in many ways that our responsibility is to give the good deposit to someone else, because we view the work of discipleship as a form of self-actualization instead of a way of being joined to something that's bigger than ourselves, both the church and a transcendent God. So I think it all is playing together. Now, there's great meaning in that. So I think that's a message that speaks to the meaning issue. But I tend to think that those who are converted to the faith, who are thinking about the work of discipleship, which is the work of being a Christian theologian, have answered the meaning question, at least initially. And what the work of discipleship does is it undergirds the meaning answer and helps it to grow.
I would agree with everything you said, but I think we're in one of these weird paradoxical times where both of the extremes on both of those questions are existing at the same
Okay.
time. And here's what I mean.
No,
So
let's
let's test
fight.
this out with you.
Okay.
Yeah, let's fight. Okay. I think that you have everything that you mentioned, and you have an overreaction to the personal in such a way that, I mean, for instance, I have found when it comes to
Hmm.
doctrine of election, I
Hmm.
believe in the doctrine of election, but you will have people who often get the entirely opposite sort of emphasis from the
Hmm.
Bibles when it comes to the doctrine of election, because it throws them into this sense of, well, yes, I know that God loves his people, but how do I know that I'm
Mm-hmm.
one of
Mm-hmm.
those? And so they're kind of, and often what I have to do is to come in and say, hey, the doctrine of election has a lot of mystery to it, but what it means is the one sheep, the shepherd comes
Mm-hmm.
looking for the one. And so the fact that you're hearing the gospel, God is personally
Mm-hmm.
engaging you with even just the situations you're in. And the other is I find a lot of people who, with all of the super imminent God stuff that you've talked about, and sometimes it's even the same people, have this super transcendent God where they think that somehow
Mm-hmm.
behind Jesus, there's a God
Mm-hmm.
who's mad at them, and Jesus is holding him off, but he really is angry with them. And they go through this sense of constant kind of lack of
Mm-hmm.
assurance
Mm-hmm.
of salvation for that
Mm-hmm.
reason. And I find myself having to say more than ever, hey, God is
Mm-hmm.
Christ-like. John 1, Jesus, in Hebrews 1, Jesus is the exact representation. So there's not some there's not some other God behind Jesus who's the
Mm-hmm.
mean one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are a lot of people who would know that at a rational level, but they've sort of adopted it at a
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
visceral level.
Mm-hmm. And so much of it depends on the tradition you grew up in. So much of it
Yeah.
depends on
Yeah.
your earthly father, frankly, a lot of the ways that we view
hmm
these things. So I guess once again, all theology is autobiography.
When you think about maybe late adolescent, early 20s Christians, or you think about people who are
Mm-hmm.
parenting adolescents and then being parents to younger adult people too. One of the things we've talked about a lot on this show, Jonathan Haidt was on with us with research that he has in terms of the ways that smartphones have led to
Mm-hmm.
increasing mental health
Mm-hmm.
issues and so forth. And one of the things that he points out that I think is right in the experience that I'm seeing is that that's affecting boys and girls, young men and young women, in very different ways, in negative ways in both cases, but in very different ways. Are you seeing that as well? And if so, how do we as a church try to help people as they move through a time like this?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I feel both grateful and sad for the period of time in which my own children were going through adolescence because the smartphone was brand new for my kids. And so there are actually some
hmm
safe measures that you can take now if you are an aware parent. So my kids both had unprecedented access in the sense that no one knew what the roadmap was going to look like, but they also had a relatively limited access because the technology was new. And so in some ways, now my kids did not have unlimited access, but the idea that all of this was brand new for them. And so I look at parents now and I think that they are the beneficiaries of a learning curve if they're paying attention. And I think that also they have a whole fresh batch of challenges in front of them because the technology keeps shifting. But
Yeah.
I don't think anybody is arguing at this point about the benefits of delaying access to those things as much as possible. And we need to be students of what's happening when kids have access. And I do think, a lot of what we're seeing, you've probably, of Katie McCoy's book, which I
hmm
think illustrates a lot of what we've seen related to just gender confusion and all kinds of things that are happening to young girls, how social contagions can take on a whole new element when you're exposed to all different forms of access to ideas. And so I think for Christian parents, yes, we need to be thinking hard about which messages we want to be the clearest and the first, and how we're going to preserve space in our homes. We can't necessarily have control. We can't have control over what happens outside of our homes, but can our homes be safe havens where when a kid walks through the door, the impulse to be on technology or the impact that technology might have on them is at least there's a reprieve for them when they're at home. And then their homes are places of conversation. I think that one of the biggest obstacles to children having a healthy relationship to technology is that their parents don't. That's not a grand statement that is original to me. It's just something that we all acknowledge to be true, but we get really forgetful of as we try to manage the problem of our children's self-control issues. But in every area of forming a child, the most formative thing for them will be your example. It just will. It's both good news and tough news because it means that the place of vigilance has to start in our own lives.
You do obviously a ton of Bible teaching in various ways, speaking and writing and everything. How do you do it? What's your way of sort of working your way through a text or an idea and getting that to what it is that you're teaching? Do you have sort of a routine?
Personally, yeah,
Yeah.
my thing is entire books of the Bible from start to finish, because when you think about Bible literacy, that's the piece that people are missing. The most underutilized tool, I believe, in our tool belts is repetitive reading. And in a day and age where you can listen, which is actually the most common way throughout human history that people would have received the scriptures, where you can listen to the scriptures while you're in your car, while you're exercising or whatever. I think we have just so much opportunity to strengthen that muscle. But the first step to being able to understand the context of what you're hearing is to just have heard what's around it a whole lot of times. And so I think people think they need to start with a commentary, but I would actually say what you need to start with is just reading it and hearing it again and again and again. And I mean, like, start at the beginning and read to the end and then go back and do that again. It's the old joke, right, of people who are preparing a message or a teaching. It's that I read it and then I read it again and then I read it again. I think that people think that can't possibly be true. They think there's some secret sauce, but there is no substitute for those repeat exposures to the entire stretch of an argument.
Do you think that it's helpful for people to do? A lot of people start at the beginning of a year, like this is beginning of a year, these sort of 1-year Bible reading plans. Is that a good way to do it in your view, or
It is a good
not?
way. That's the sprint. That's you're not going to do a deep dive into any one of those books. And I think you have to kind of ask, what have I spent the most time doing? I think what we don't always do when we're thinking about our own issues with Bible literacy is to diagnose what we've been doing before we start to do what we're going to do next. So in the same way that if I had an issue with spending money and I felt like I wasn't spending money the way that was most helpful or beneficial, I wouldn't start by making a budget. I would start by going back and looking at how I had been spending time. And so, a major contributor to the Bible literacy crisis in the pink ghetto in women's ministry is that we have called everything a Bible study, when in fact, sometimes what was being done was a topical study, or was we were reading someone's book and discussing it. And when you call everything a Bible study, you can find yourself, as we do indeed find ourselves, with women who have spent 30 years going to something that was called a Bible study, and they still don't know the Bible. So in that case, if you're a ministry leader, you should evaluate, what are we offering? Do we have offerings? And do we have a scope and a sequence to what we're offering? Are we telling people, hey, start here before you go here? Hey, a topical study is going to help you a lot more after you have done some line by line study. And so when you look at a Bible reading plan, that is a tool. It's going to give you the whole stretch. And so that's a really good, important thing. But we also need times where we are doing a book of the Bible. And we might also need times where we are studying just the Sermon on the Mount, but and depending on your tradition and your church that you're in, my guess is they prioritize one or two of those things and they deprioritize other things. And then you yourself might do the same. If you are heavily involved in devotional reading, and that is the case for many of us, I would say that you should ask yourself, are there ways I should be spending my time interacting with the scriptures that don't involve what devotional reading delivers, which is that emotional quick hit? There are not devotionals written over the book of Leviticus, but if all scripture is God-breathed and profitable, then we should be working to spend time in all of it. So it's recognizing where we have spent a lot. It's like if you only had leg day in your workout and you never did any of the other aspects of the workout. I said that like I actually work out. I don't. Not even a little.
Yeah, I have one last question. This is not about in terms of for the wholeness of your life, but if God were to show up and say, for the next 5 years, Jen, you can only teach one book of the Bible, but you get to pick what it is for the next 5 years. And you get to teach on one theological topic and not any others for 5 years. What are you going to pick?
So those are two separate answers, right? I get one book and one issue. Okay, the book would be Genesis. And because it's the seed plot of the Bible. And if I can get you to understand Genesis, I mean, I'd like to just say Genesis and Exodus, but you're not going to let me. But if you can understand the seed plot of the Bible, then you're in a much better position to understand the story of the Bible as a whole. So yeah, I mean, everything, the starter kit is in Genesis. So I would teach Genesis everywhere and in all places. And I would teach the doctrine of God because, I tell women, I challenge women and men, that the Bible is a book about God, which is an obvious statement, and everyone would agree with it. But what we come to realize, the more we examine the doctrine of God and that the Bible is a book about God, is that we actually read it more often than not as though it's a book about us. And so I don't assume that just because we understand that the Bible is a book about God and we should read it as such, that we have the lenses to do so. And teaching the doctrine of God helps people to have a developed vocabulary around what is true about him, and then to look with greater eagerness toward the scriptures to see those things revealed.
Jen Wilkin, author, Bible teacher with JT English. Most recent book is You Are a Theologian, An Invitation to Know and Love God Well. Thanks for being with us, Jen.
Thanks for having me.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Host, Russell Moore. Producer, Ashley Hales. Associate producers, Abby Perry and Mackenzie Hill. Director of Operations for CT Media, Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.